In the darkest corner of a war-torn cantina on the edge of civilized space, where the stench of fear mingles with alien liquor, sits a warrior whose name once struck terror across 3 galaxy arcs. Zektar, the Destroyer, veteran of 1,000 campaigns, conqueror of worlds, now stares into his drink with trembling claws. He speaks only when the alcohol dulls the nightmares, when the screaming in his head quiets to a whisper. Tonight, as storm winds howl outside, and the cantina empties of all but the most desperate souls, he begins to tell his story. Not of his victories, not of his glory, but of the species that broke him. The humans. You want to know why the Galactic Empire fell? He rasps, his voice like grinding metal. Why are fleets of 10 million ships scattered like dust before a solar wind? Why warriors who had never known defeat suddenly forgot how to hold their weapons? His eyes, once proud golden orbs that reflected the deaths of civilizations, now hold only the hollow stare of the broken. It wasn't their technology, wasn't their numbers. It was something far worse, something we never saw coming until it was too late. He takes another drink, and the liquid burns away another layer of his sanity. They made us afraid. Us, the apex predators of the galaxy. And by the time we understood what we were truly fighting, the war was already over. The amber liquid burned down Zektar's throat as he leaned back in the worn booth, his scarred hide reflecting the dim lighting of the cantina. The stranger across from him, a young Vorthan journalist with eager green eyes, waited with barely contained excitement. Few beings in the galaxy had the opportunity to hear first-hand accounts from one of the Empire's most decorated warriors. "You must understand," Zektar began, his voice carrying the weight of terrible memories. "When we first encountered humanity, they were nothing. A backwater species that had barely crawled out of their gravity well. Their technology was primitive, their ships were slow, and their weapons were laughable by our standards." The journalist leaned forward, recording device humming softly. But something changed? Zektar's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter amusement. Everything changed, but not in the way you think. He gazed out the grimy window at the alien stars, remembering a time when he commanded respect across the galaxy. "I was fleet commander of the 7th Subjugation Force then. 40,000 ships under my command, each one capable of glassing a planet. We had conquered the Altari Collective in 3 days, crushed the vegan resistance in less than a week. When command assigned us to deal with this new species calling themselves humans, I thought it would be target practice." The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. The first human colony world they had approached, designated Sol 7 in their tactical database, had been a small mining operation on a frozen rock orbiting a dying star. Intelligence reports suggested a population of maybe 50,000 humans, equipped with primitive kinetic weapons and basic energy shields. Standard protocol was simple. Zektar continued, taking another drink. Arrive in force, demonstrate overwhelming superiority, demand surrender. Those who complied became slaves. Those who resisted became examples. But from the moment their massive fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Sol 7, something felt different. The human response was unlike anything they had encountered before. Instead of the usual mix of panic and desperate attempts at negotiation, the human communication channels had gone completely silent for nearly 6 hours. "We thought they were paralyzed with fear," Zektar said, his voice growing quieter. "We had seen it before with other species. The shock of seeing a fleet that could turn their world into molten rock often left them catatonic. So we waited. We had time." The first sign that something was wrong came from the sensor operators. They began reporting strange readings from the planet's surface, energy signatures that didn't match any known weapon systems. More disturbing were the reports of human ships, small craft barely larger than shuttles, launching from hidden positions throughout the system. "My tactical officer, a Zephyrian named Kralvex, came to me with a report I initially dismissed," Zektar said. He claimed that over 200 human vessels had launched from various positions around the system, but they weren't fleeing. They were taking positions. The human ships were tiny by Imperial standards, each one perhaps a tenth the size of the Empire's smallest frigate. Their energy signatures were barely detectable, and their movement patterns were erratic, unpredictable. Standard targeting systems had difficulty maintaining locks on vessels that seemed to dance through space like living creatures. "I should have recognized the signs then," Zektar muttered, his claws scraping against the metal table. "But arrogance blinded me. 40,000 ships against 200? It wasn't even a battle in my mind. It was pest control. The first human transmission, finally, came 18 hours after the Imperial fleet's arrival. The voice was calm, measured, speaking in accented galactic standard with no trace of the fear or desperation they had come to expect. Imperial fleet, this is Commander Sarah Chun of the Sol 7 Defense Force. You have entered human space without authorization. You have exactly 1 hour to withdraw, or we will consider your presence an act of war. The bridge of Zektar's flagship had erupted in laughter. His officers, veterans of dozens of campaigns, found the human audacity hilarious. A demand for withdrawal from a species they could wipe out with a single volley? It was almost insulting. I remember my response word for word, Zektar said, his voice filled with shame. I told her that she had 1 hour to organize the complete surrender of her forces, or I would demonstrate the price of defying the Empire. The human response had been even more unexpected than their initial demand. Understood, Fleet Commander. Thank you for the warning. Thank you for the warning, Zektar repeated to the journalist. Not defiance, not threats, not begging. They thanked me for the warning. The hour passed with no further communication from the humans. Their small ships continued their strange dance through space, never approaching close enough for effective targeting, but never retreating either. Some of his tactical officers had suggested opening fire immediately, but Zektar had decided to let the deadline pass. Let them see the futility of resistance before the slaughter began. When the hour ended, I gave the order to commence bombardment, Zektar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Targeting the planet's major population centers first, as per standard doctrine. The Imperial fleet's opening volley should have been devastating. Thousands of plasma cannons fired simultaneously, enough destructive power to crack continental plates and boil oceans. The energy beams lanced through space towards Sol 7, and for a moment, Zektar felt the familiar satisfaction of another easy victory. Then, the impossible happened. The beams never reached the planet, he said, his hands beginning to shake slightly. Somehow, impossibly, the humans intercepted them. The small human ships had suddenly accelerated beyond anything their sensors had indicated was possible, moving with precision that defied physics as the Empire understood it. They hadn't tried to block the plasma beams with shields or armor. Instead, they had positioned themselves in the path of the energy and somehow absorbed it. At first, we thought it was some kind of suicide run, Zektar explained. Ships that small shouldn't have been able to withstand even a fraction of that energy. We expected them to vaporize instantly. But the human ships didn't vaporize. Instead, they began to glow with absorbed energy, their hulls taking on an ominous luminescence that seemed to pulse with captured plasma fire. And then, as the Imperial fleet watched in growing confusion, the human ships began to move again. They weren't just absorbing our weapons, Zektar said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. They were feeding on them. The tactical implications hit the Imperial fleet like a physical blow. Their greatest advantage, the overwhelming firepower that had subjugated dozens of species, had just been turned into fuel for their enemies. But even more disturbing was what happened next. The human ships began to return fire. But their weapons weren't the primitive kinetic guns or basic energy weapons that Imperial intelligence had reported. Each human vessel erupted with energy signatures that matched exactly what they had just absorbed from the Imperial plasma cannons. The Empire's own weapons, somehow captured and redirected, came screaming back at them with interest. The first ship we lost was the cruiser Domination's Edge, Zektar said, his voice hollow. Direct hit to the command section. 12,000 crew. Gone in seconds. The plasma beam that destroyed the cruiser had been more powerful than anything the Imperial fleet had fired. Somehow, the humans had not only absorbed the energy, but amplified it. Within minutes, the space around Sol 7 had turned into a nightmare of reflected destruction as human ships danced between Imperial vessels, drinking in their firepower and spitting it back tenfold. My fleet officers were screaming for retreat, Zektar continued. They had never seen anything like it. Ships that fed on weapons fire. Vessels that moved like they were alive. Humans who fought like they had been born for war. But Zektar was not just any fleet commander. He was Zektar, the destroyer, conqueror of worlds, and he had not earned his reputation by retreating from the first sign of resistance. If conventional weapons were ineffective, then he would adapt. I ordered the fleet to switch to kinetic bombardment, he said. Solid projectiles, moving at a significant fraction of light speed. No energy for them to absorb, just pure kinetic force. The Imperial fleet's railguns spoke with deadly authority, hurling metallic slugs the size of buildings toward both the human ships and the planet itself. These weapons had shattered space stations and punched through planetary defenses that had taken centuries to build. Surely no species could have a defense against simple kinetic force. The humans proved him wrong again. This time, they didn't absorb the incoming projectiles. Instead, they did something that violated everything the Empire thought they knew about space combat. The human ships began to work together in ways that seemed almost telepathic, their movements becoming synchronized to a degree that suggested either perfect communication or some form of hive mind. They caught them, Zektar said, his voice filled with disbelief even now. Somehow, impossibly, they caught projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The human ships had formed complex geometric patterns in space, creating what appeared to be some kind of gravitational net. The incoming kinetic projectiles had slowed as they approached the human formations, their deadly velocity bleeding away until they came to complete stops relative to the human vessels. And then the humans had thrown them back. But they didn't just return our kinetic rounds, Zektar explained. They accelerated them beyond what our own weapons could achieve. The return volleys hit us at speeds that our armor couldn't even register before they punched through. The second wave of Imperial losses had been even more devastating than the first. Ship after ship found themselves impaled by their own ammunition, returned with modifications that made them far more deadly than when they had been fired. Hull plating that could withstand direct hits from plasma cannons proved useless against kinetic projectiles that moved so fast they seemed to phase through matter. In 30 minutes of combat, I had lost over 3,000 ships, Zektar said, his voice breaking slightly. 3,000 vessels, each one representing decades of construction and thousands of trained crew members. And we hadn't even scratched the human forces. The retreat order should have been given then. Any rational commander would have recognized that they were facing technology and tactics so far beyond their understanding that continued engagement was suicidal. But Zektar's pride would not allow him to withdraw from a battle against such a primitive species. I convinced myself that we were facing some kind of ancient technology, he said, that the humans had found artifacts from one of the precursor races. It was the only explanation that made sense. He had ordered his fleet to pull back to maximum weapons range and attempt a different strategy. If direct engagement was impossible, then perhaps they could wear down the humans through attrition. The Imperial fleet began a systematic bombardment of the outer system, targeting anything that might be providing support to the human defenders. The response from the human ships was immediate and terrifying. They began to sing. Not literal singing, Zektar explained quickly, seeing the journalist's confused expression. But that's what we called it. Some kind of harmonic frequency that our communication equipment picked up. At first, we thought it might be an attempt at communication. But as the harmonic frequencies continued, Imperial equipment throughout the fleet began to malfunction. Navigation systems reported impossible readings. Weapons targeting computers began selecting friendly vessels as targets. Life support systems fluctuated between scorching heat and deadly cold. The humans weren't just fighting our ships, Zektar said. They were fighting our technology itself. The harmonic frequencies seemed designed to exploit weaknesses in Imperial systems that the Empire hadn't even known existed. Equipment that had functioned flawlessly for centuries suddenly became unreliable. Ships that had conquered worlds found themselves unable to maintain basic operations. And through it all, the human ships kept dancing, Zektar continued, moving through our formations like they belonged there, like space itself was welcoming them home. The final blow to his tactical assumptions came when the human ships began to demonstrate capabilities that redefined what the Empire thought was possible in space combat. They started moving through what appeared to be folded space, disappearing from one location and reappearing in another without any detectable transition. Not hyperspace jumps, Zektar clarified. We knew how those looked, how they registered on sensors. This was something else entirely. They were moving through dimensions that our instruments couldn't even detect. As his fleet struggled with malfunctioning equipment and an enemy that seemed to violate the laws of physics, Zektar had received a communication from the planet's surface. The same calm voice from Commander Chun, but this time with an undertone that sent chills through his armored hide. Fleet Commander, this is your final warning. Withdraw now, or face the consequences of continuing this aggression. The consequences, Zektar repeated to the journalist, as if losing 10% of my fleet in the first hour wasn't consequence enough. But his pride, his certainty in imperial superiority, had demanded that he continue the engagement. He had convinced himself that the humans were simply using tricks and advanced technology to create an illusion of superiority. Once his fleet adapted to their tactics, the true battle would begin. He could not have been more wrong. The real horror was about to begin, and everything he'd seen so far had merely been the humans holding back, testing imperial capabilities before revealing what they were truly capable of in combat. As Zektar finished his drink and gestured for another, he could see in the journalist's eyes the same skeptical disbelief that he had once felt toward reports of human capabilities. Soon, that disbelief would turn to the same haunted understanding that had driven him to this cantina at the edge of known space, drinking to forget battles that had redefined his understanding of warfare itself. The cantina had grown quieter as Zektar's tale progressed, other patrons unconsciously leaning closer to catch his words. The veteran warrior's claws traced patterns in the condensation on his glass as he gathered the strength to continue. What happened next, he said slowly, changed everything we thought we knew about warfare. The journalist shifted uncomfortably. Even in this dim, smoky establishment at the galaxy's edge, stories of human military capability were spoken of in whispers. Most beings preferred not to think about what had happened to the mighty Imperial fleet. After my refusal to withdraw, the humans went silent again, Zektar continued. For exactly 1 hour. During that time, our sensors detected massive energy buildups throughout the system, not from their ships, but from the planet itself. He paused, taking a long drink before continuing. The memory of what came next still had the power to make his hands shake. We thought they were powering up some kind of planetary defense grid, something we could overwhelm with concentrated fire. But what they were actually doing was far worse. The hour of silence had been more unnerving than the initial battle. Imperial sensors detected increasing activity across Sol 7's surface, energy signatures that seemed to be building towards some kind of massive discharge. Zektar's tactical officers had recommended immediate full-scale bombardment, but something about the situation felt wrong to him. The energy readings didn't match any known weapon system, he explained. They were too diffuse, too widespread. It was as if the entire planet was becoming some kind of massive weapon. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't with the voice of Commander Chun. Instead, every communication channel on every Imperial ship received the same transmission simultaneously, not broadcast from any detectable source, but somehow appearing directly in their systems as if it had materialized from nothing. This is Admiral Marcus Thompson, commanding the Sol Defense Initiative. Imperial Fleet, you have ignored our warnings and continued your aggression against human space. You have demonstrated that you do not understand the nature of what you face. The voice was different from Chen's measured tones. Where she had been professional, almost courteous, this new voice carried undertones that made Zektar's predatory instincts scream warnings. It was the voice of something that had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. You wanted to see what humans can do when threatened. We are about to show you. That's when the planet started to change, Zektar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not the surface, but the planet itself. Imperial sensors detected massive gravitational anomalies beginning to emanate from Sol 7. The planet's magnetic field started to fluctuate in patterns that defied natural explanation. Most disturbing of all, the planet's rotation began to slow. Not gradually, Zektar clarified, seeing the journalist's expression. In minutes, a world that had been spinning for billions of years was being slowed by deliberate application of force. The implications were staggering. The amount of energy required to alter a planet's rotation was beyond anything the Empire had ever conceived of as a weapon. Even their most powerful world crackers worked by triggering natural geological processes. This was direct application of force on a planetary scale. But that wasn't the weapon, Zektar continued. That was just the power source. As Sol 7's rotation slowed, the energy being extracted was channeled into something that Imperial science could barely comprehend. The space around the planet began to ripple with gravitational distortions, reality itself bending under the application of forces that treated the fundamental laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolute rules. And then, Zektar said, they started building. The gravitational distortions began to take shape, forming complex geometric patterns in space around Sol 7. But these weren't simple force fields or energy barriers. The humans were somehow using gravity itself as a construction material, weaving it into structures that existed in dimensions Imperial sensors could barely detect. They were building a machine, Zektar explained, using gravity and space-time itself as components. A machine the size of a small moon. The construction process took less than an hour, but watching it unfold was like observing gods at work. The humans weren't using any visible technology, no massive engineering ships or construction platforms. Instead, they seemed to be manipulating reality through pure will and understanding of physics that was so advanced it appeared to be magic. My science officers were going insane trying to understand what they were seeing, Zektar said. Equipment designed to analyze any known technology was returning readings that suggested the humans were building with materials that didn't exist. When the construction was complete, the weapon that emerged was unlike anything in Imperial arsenals. It wasn't a massive cannon or energy projector. Instead, it appeared to be a complex arrangement of gravitational lenses and space-time manipulators that seemed to focus the very fabric of reality into a tool of destruction. They called it the probability cascade, Zektar said. Admiral Thompson explained it to us before they activated it. The transmission from the human admiral had been clinical, almost educational in tone, as if he were delivering a lecture to particularly slow students. Fleet Commander, what you're about to experience is a weapon that doesn't destroy matter or energy. Instead, it destroys possibility. Every decision your ships could make, every evasive maneuver, every tactical option, every escape route. The probability cascade calculates them all and removes them from reality. I didn't understand what he meant, Zektar admitted. How do you remove possibility? How do you destroy something that doesn't physically exist? The answer came when the weapon activated. Imperial ships throughout the fleet suddenly found themselves unable to maneuver. Not because their engines had failed or their navigation systems had been compromised, but because the space around them had been altered so that movement in any direction except toward the human forces was no longer possible. It wasn't a force field, Zektar explained. Force fields can be broken or overwhelmed. This was different. Space itself had been modified so that certain directions simply didn't exist anymore. Ships that tried to retreat found their engines pushing them forward instead. Vessels attempting evasive maneuvers discovered that their course corrections were redirecting them into optimal firing positions for human weapons. Even random movements, desperate attempts to break free through unpredictable action, somehow resulted in positioning that favored human tactical superiority. Our weapons wouldn't fire backward, Zektar continued, his voice filled with the remembered frustration. The targeting systems could lock onto the human ships, the weapons could charge and prepare to fire, but when the order was given, nothing happened. The probability cascade had somehow made it impossible for Imperial weapons to target anything except empty space. Not through jamming or interference, but by altering the fundamental probabilities that govern cause and effect. The possibility of Imperial weapons harming human forces had been removed from the local space. But the humans could still fire at us, Zektar said bitterly. Their weapons worked perfectly, because the machine had made our destruction inevitable. The slaughter that followed was unlike anything the Empire had ever experienced. Imperial ships found themselves perfectly positioned to receive human fire while being unable to return it. Evasive maneuvers only served to present better targeting angles. Defensive formations somehow transformed themselves into optimal attack patterns for human forces. We lost 12,000 ships in the first 10 minutes, Zektar said, his voice hollow. Not to superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. We lost them to weaponized fate. But even as his fleet died around him, Zektar had been analyzing the human weapon, searching for weaknesses or limitations. The probability cascade was clearly powerful beyond imagination, but it had to have limits. No weapon was perfect. I realized that the machine required enormous amounts of energy to maintain, he said. The power they were drawing from their planet's rotation couldn't last forever. If I could keep enough ships alive long enough, eventually the weapon would exhaust itself. Acting on this realization, Zektar had ordered his remaining vessels to adopt defensive formations and focus entirely on survival. If they couldn't attack or retreat, they could at least try to endure until the human weapon depleted its power source. That's when I learned something even more terrifying about humans, he said. They had been holding back. Instead of continuing to use the probability cascade to systematically destroy Imperial ships, the human forces began to demonstrate capabilities that made their previous displays seem restrained. Ships that had been moving in impossible ways began to phase in and out of visible reality. Human vessels started appearing inside Imperial formations without any detectable means of travel. They weren't teleporting, Zektar clarified. Teleportation leaves energy signatures, creates disturbances in space. This was different. They were moving through dimensions that our instruments couldn't detect. The human ships began appearing inside Imperial vessels, not causing collisions, but somehow occupying the same space without interference. From these positions, they could attack Imperial ships from within their own defensive perimeters, striking its systems and crew without having to penetrate armor or shields. Imagine, Zektar said, enemy fighters materializing inside your flagship's bridge, not breaking through defenses, not forcing their way in, but simply existing in the same space as your command center while somehow avoiding any physical interaction with the matter around them. The attacks from within were surgical and precise. Human forces would materialize inside critical system areas, deliver targeted strikes that disabled specific functions, then phase back out of normal space before Imperial security could respond. Ships found their life support failing, their navigation systems crashing, their weapons powering down, all from attacks that originated inside their own hulls. We couldn't defend against it, Zektar continued. How do you fight an enemy that can exist inside your own armor? How do you protect systems from attacks that come from within? As if these capabilities weren't terrifying enough, the human ships began demonstrating what appeared to be time manipulation. Imperial sensors detected the same human vessels existing in multiple locations simultaneously, attacking from several different positions at once. Not copies or duplicates, Zektar explained. The same ships, somehow existing at different points in time and space simultaneously. They were fighting us from past and future positions while maintaining their presence in the current moment. The temporal attacks were the most disorienting aspect of the battle. Imperial ships would find themselves under fire from weapons that hadn't been fired yet, taking damage from attacks that existed in potential futures. Conversely, damage from past engagements would suddenly manifest on ships that had been undamaged moments before. Time itself became a weapon, Zektar said. They were fighting us across multiple temporal dimensions, using causality as a tactical advantage. But the most devastating demonstration of human capability came when they began to affect Imperial personnel directly, not through conventional weapons or energy attacks, but by somehow altering the probability matrices that governed biological functions. Crew members throughout the fleet began experiencing what our medical officers called selective failure syndrome, Zektar explained. Not poison, not disease, not injury. Their bodies simply began to forget how to perform specific functions. Imperial warriors found their trigger fingers unable to squeeze. Navigators discovered they could no longer calculate simple trajectories. Engineers lost the ability to distinguish between different system controls. The humans were somehow removing specific capabilities from enemy personnel without causing any detectable physical harm. They weren't killing us, Zektar said. They were making us useless. The psychological effect was worse than direct combat casualties. Imperial crew members could feel their competencies disappearing, their trained abilities simply ceasing to exist. Warriors who had spent decades mastering weapons handling suddenly found themselves unable to understand how their equipment functioned. Imagine losing your ability to speak your native language, Zektar said, knowing that you once possessed the knowledge, but finding it completely gone, as if it had never existed. As his fleet continued to disintegrate under attacks that redefined the nature of warfare itself, Zektar had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He activated the Imperial Emergency Beacon, broadcasting a fleet-wide surrender signal that would be received by every military installation within 50 light years. Surrender, he said quietly. The word we had never spoken, the concept we had never considered. But even surrender wasn't enough to stop what was happening to his fleet. The human attacks continued, not out of bloodlust or vengeance, but as if the very act of Imperial resistance had triggered something that couldn't be easily stopped. Admiral Thompson contacted me directly, Zektar said. His words are burned into my memory forever. The human admiral's voice had carried a mixture of regret and terrible certainty. Fleet Commander, your surrender is acknowledged, but the weapons we've deployed against you operate on principles that transcend simple orders. We initiated forces that exist outside normal space and time. Stopping them requires procedures that take time to implement. He was telling me, Zektar explained, that even they couldn't simply turn off what they had activated. The implications were staggering. The humans had deployed weapons so advanced that even their creators needed time to deactivate them safely. These weren't conventional military tools, but forces that operated according to physics, so advanced that they required careful handling even by their users. For 6 hours, we continue to die, Zektar said. Not from active human attacks, but from weapons that continued to operate independently. Self-sustaining destruction that fed on our presence and grew stronger with each ship it destroyed. When the attacks finally stopped, less than 5,000 ships remained from Zektar's original force of 40,000. The survivors were damaged beyond repair, their crews psychologically shattered, their equipment forever altered by exposure to weapons that existed outside normal reality. But the humans weren't finished with us, Zektar said, reaching for another drink. What happened next proved that everything we had experienced was just the beginning of our education about what humanity was capable of when threatened. Zektar's claws drummed against the table as he stared into his glass, the amber liquid reflecting the haunted expression in his eyes. The journalist waited patiently, understanding that these memories came with their own timeline, their own pace that couldn't be rushed. What the humans did next, Zektar finally continued, taught me that we had never understood what we were fighting. We thought they were just another species with advanced technology. We were wrong. The silence following the end of active hostilities had been more terrifying than the battle itself. 5,000 damaged Imperial ships hung in space around Sol 7, their crews waiting for either rescue or destruction. Most expected the humans to finish what they had started, to complete the annihilation of Zektar's fleet. Instead, the humans began broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies simultaneously. This is Admiral Thompson. Surviving Imperial vessels. You will now be educated. Educated, Zektar repeated, his voice heavy with bitter memory. Not destroyed, not imprisoned, not enslaved. Educated. The first lesson came in the form of historical data transmissions. Detailed records of human development, their social evolution, their technological advancement. But these weren't simple information dumps or propaganda broadcasts. The humans were somehow transmitting the data directly into Imperial minds, bypassing their communication equipment entirely. We suddenly knew things about humanity that we had never learned, Zektar explained. Not as dry facts or recorded information, but as lived experience. We could feel what it was like to be human. The experience was overwhelming. Imperial minds, evolved for conquest and domination, suddenly found themselves experiencing emotions and concepts that were fundamentally alien to their nature. Compassion, self-sacrifice, hope in the face of impossible odds. The humans were somehow sharing their own psychological framework with their enemies. I felt what it was like to be a human child, Zektar said quietly. The wonder of discovering the stars, the dream of exploring beyond their homeworld. I experienced their curiosity, their desire to understand rather than simply conquer. But the humans weren't trying to convert their enemies or make them sympathetic to human values. Instead, they were providing context for what came next. They wanted the Imperial survivors to understand exactly what kind of species they had chosen to attack. The second lesson was about human history, Zektar continued. Specifically, their history of warfare. The transmitted data included detailed records of human conflicts throughout their development. Not sanitized historical summaries, but raw, visceral experiences of human combat across millennia. The Imperial survivors found themselves witnessing humanity's capacity for violence from the inside. We experienced their ancient wars, Zektar said, his voice growing quieter. Battles fought with primitive weapons, conflicts that raged for generations. But what terrified me wasn't their capacity for violence. It was their capacity for learning. Human warfare had evolved constantly throughout their history. Every conflict had generated new tactics, new technologies, new understandings of combat. But more than that, humans had demonstrated an ability to adapt their fighting methods to match any opponent, to find weaknesses in any defense, to overcome any advantage through innovation and determination. They had been fighting each other for thousands of years, Zektar explained, perfecting the art of warfare against opponents who shared their own intelligence and creativity. When we attacked them, we weren't fighting a peaceful species learning combat for the first time. We were fighting masters of war who had spent millennia refining their skills. The transmitted experiences included battles where humans had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious through cunning and determination. Conflicts where technological disadvantages had been overcome through tactical innovation. Wars where human forces had adapted to enemy advantages so completely that they had turned those same advantages into weaknesses. But even that wasn't the most important lesson, Zektar said. The third transmission showed us something about human nature that made our defeat inevitable. The final educational broadcast dealt with human response patterns when threatened. The Imperial survivors experienced firsthand how humans reacted to existential threats, how their psychology shifted when their survival was at stake. Humans, Zektar said slowly, become more dangerous when threatened, not less. Most species in the galaxy followed predictable patterns when faced with superior force. They would either submit immediately or fight desperately until overwhelmed. But humans had evolved a different response entirely. Threat didn't break them or cause panic. Instead, it triggered what they called their survival protocols. When facing extinction, humans don't just fight harder, Zektar explained. They become smarter, more creative, more willing to use any method, any tool, any advantage to ensure their survival. The transmitted experiences showed Imperial minds what it felt like when human survival protocols activated. The sudden shift from normal human consciousness to something far more focused and deadly. The way human creativity, normally used for art and exploration, could be instantly redirected toward finding new ways to destroy threats. They had been holding back during our entire engagement, Zektar realized aloud. Everything we experienced, all their impossible weapons and tactics, those were restraint measures. Admiral Thompson's voice returned to confirm this terrible understanding. Fleet Commander, your species attacked us believing we were primitive and defenseless. You have now seen approximately 0.01% of human defensive capabilities. These weapons were developed specifically for fighting our own kind. Against alien attackers, we have tools that are far more effective. 0.01%, Zektar repeated. Everything that had destroyed most of my fleet represented less than 1/100% of their actual capability. The implications were staggering. If the probability cascade and temporal weapons were considered restraint measures, what could humans deploy when they decided to fight without limitations? Admiral Thompson answered that question, Zektar said. The fourth transmission showed us human weapons designed specifically for fighting alien species. The new data stream contained technical specifications for weapons that were fundamentally different from anything humans had used against the Imperial fleet. These weren't tools for fighting other humans, with their shared biology and psychology. These were instruments designed to combat alien physiology, alien psychology, alien technology. Species-specific biological agents that could target any known alien DNA structure, Zektar listed, his voice growing more strained. Psychological weapons designed to exploit the specific mental patterns of different alien races. Technology viruses that could adapt to and destroy any non-human computer system. But the most terrifying weapons in the human arsenal weren't technological at all. They were social and political tools designed to turn alien civilizations against themselves. Humans had developed techniques for infiltrating and destabilizing alien governments, Zektar explained. Not through force or coercion, but by understanding alien social structures so completely that they could manipulate them from within. The transmitted data included case studies of how humans could insert themselves into alien societies, gain positions of trust and influence, then guide those civilizations towards self-destruction without ever revealing their true nature or intentions. They called it cultural warfare, Zektar said. The ability to destroy entire civilizations by convincing them to destroy themselves. But Admiral Thompson wasn't finished with his educational program. The fifth transmission dealt with human strategic thinking and long-term planning. Your empire, the Admiral's voice announced, has been under human observation for the past century. We have detailed analyses of your technology, your social structures, your military doctrine, and your species psychology. We know more about your capabilities than your own intelligence services do. The data stream that followed contained Imperial military secrets that even Zektar hadn't been cleared to access. Complete technical specifications for their most advanced weapons, detailed analyses of their strategic weaknesses, comprehensive profiles of their military leadership. They had been watching us, Zektar said in amazement. Learning about us, studying us, preparing for eventual contact. While we dismissed them as primitives, they were analyzing our entire civilization. The Human Intelligence Network was far more comprehensive than anything the Empire had ever achieved. They had infiltrated Imperial space through methods that were completely undetectable, gathering information on technologies and capabilities that were considered state secrets. But they hadn't used this intelligence to attack us, Zektar realized. They had used it to prepare defenses against us. Everything the humans had deployed against his fleet had been specifically designed to counter Imperial tactics and weapons. The probability cascade hadn't been a general-purpose weapon, but a tool created specifically to neutralize Imperial space superiority. The temporal attacks had been designed to exploit weaknesses in Imperial navigation systems. They had spent decades preparing for a war that we started, Zektar said. While we planned conquest, they planned survival. Admiral Thompson's final transmission contained an offer that stunned the Imperial survivors. Fleet Commander, you and your remaining crews will now be returned to Imperial space. Your ships will be repaired, your wounded will be healed, and you will be given safe passage to the nearest Imperial installation. Returned, Zektar repeated. Not as prisoners, not as slaves, but as messengers. The human intention became clear. They weren't interested in conquest or domination. They wanted the Empire to understand exactly what would happen if the attacks continued. Zektar and his survivors were being sent home to deliver a warning. The sixth transmission was a message for the Imperial High Command, Zektar said. A message I was required to deliver personally. The final data stream contained detailed specifications for weapons that humans could deploy if the Empire chose to continue hostilities. Not the defensive measures that had been used against Zektar's fleet, but offensive capabilities designed to project human power across interstellar distances. Planet crackers that could destroy worlds from outside the same star system, Zektar listed. Stellar manipulation tools that could cause stars to go nova on command. Space-time weapons that could erase entire regions of the galaxy from existence. But the most devastating weapon in the human arsenal was their ability to accelerate their own technological development. The transmitted data showed that humans could advance their capabilities by centuries within decades when threatened, adapting their technology to match any new challenge almost instantaneously. They weren't just offering to destroy us, Zektar realized. They were offering to evolve beyond us so completely that we would become irrelevant. Admiral Thompson's final words had been delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized all human communications. Fleet Commander, inform your superiors that humanity wishes to coexist peacefully with all sentient species. However, if the Empire chooses to continue its aggressive expansion into human space, we will respond with measures designed to ensure that such expansion never occurs again. Never occurs again, Zektar repeated. Not just stop, but made permanently impossible. As promised, the humans had repaired Imperial ships and healed Imperial wounded with technology that was so advanced it seemed miraculous. Injuries that should have been fatal were completely cured. Ships that had been destroyed beyond salvage were restored to better condition than when they had been built. They fixed us, Zektar said with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Made us better than we had been before. Then, sent us home to deliver their warning. The return journey to Imperial space had taken months, but every surviving crew member had spent that time processing what they had experienced. The transmitted knowledge didn't fade or distort. It remained as clear and detailed as the moment it had been received. By the time we reached Imperial space, Zektar said, every one of us understood that we had survived contact with something far beyond our ability to comprehend or oppose. The debriefing sessions had been nightmarish. Imperial intelligence had initially refused to believe their reports, dismissing the accounts as hallucinations or human psychological warfare. But the technical data the humans had transmitted proved accurate in every detail, confirming that humanity possessed intelligence capabilities that rendered Imperial security meaningless. High Command faced a choice, Zektar said. Accept the human warning and avoid further contact, or escalate the conflict and face the consequences. The journalist leaned forward, knowing that the answer would determine the fate of civilizations. What did they choose? The cantina's atmosphere had grown heavy with tension as other patrons unconsciously gathered closer to hear Zektar's tale. Even beings who had never served in military forces understood the significance of what they were hearing. The story of the Empire's decision would shape the future of galactic civilization. High Command, Zektar said bitterly, chose pride over wisdom. He drained his glass before continuing, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable tragedy. The Imperial High Council met for 7 days after receiving our report. 7 days to decide the fate of our civilization. The debates have been intense and polarizing. Conservative factions within the High Council argued for accepting the human warning and avoiding further contact. They pointed to the technical data that proved human capabilities were far beyond Imperial understanding. The evidence was overwhelming, the threat clear. But the Empire had never retreated from a challenge, Zektar explained. Our entire culture was built on the concept of inevitable victory. The idea that any species could force us to abandon expansion was unthinkable to most council members. The aggressive factions had a different interpretation of the human demonstration. They argued that humanity's restraint proved weakness, not strength. If humans truly possessed such devastating capabilities, why hadn't they used them? Why repair Imperial ships and release prisoners? General Vakthul spoke for the war faction, Zektar said, his voice filled with remembered frustration. He claimed that human mercy was evidence of their inability to commit to true warfare. Vakthul's argument had been persuasive to those who wanted to believe it. He suggested that humans were psychologically incapable of using their most powerful weapons, that their emotional nature would prevent them from deploying truly devastating force against sentient beings. He convinced the Council that humanity was bluffing, Zektar continued, that they had developed powerful defensive weapons, but lacked the will to use them offensively. The decision to escalate had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. The Empire interpreted human restraint through their own cultural framework, assuming that mercy indicated weakness rather than choice. The High Council authorized the mobilization of Battlefleet Prime, Zektar said quietly. 2 million ships, including our most advanced dreadnoughts and world killers. The largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. But the Empire had learned from Zektar's encounter. Battlefleet Prime wouldn't make the same mistakes as Force had made. They would approach human space with new tactics, improved weapons, and strategic advantages designed to counter human capabilities. They gave fleet command to Admiral Kree Thak, the World Ender, Zektar said with obvious reluctance. A strategist who had never been defeated, a warrior who had personally conquered 16 civilizations. Kree Thak had studied every detail of Zektar's encounter, analyzing human capabilities and developing countermeasures. His fleet was equipped with experimental weapons designed specifically to combat the unusual tactics humans had employed. Temporal stabilizers to prevent time manipulation attacks, Zektar listed. Quantum anchors to stop dimensional phasing. Probability shields to block reality alteration weapons. Kree Thak believed he could neutralize human advantages through superior preparation. The Empire's new strategy was based on overwhelming force applied so rapidly that humans wouldn't have time to deploy their most sophisticated weapons. Battlefleet Prime would strike simultaneously at dozens of human colonies, forcing humanity to spread their defenses too thin to be effective. It should have worked, Zektar admitted. Against any other species in the galaxy, Kree Thak's strategy would have guaranteed victory. But humanity wasn't any other species. The first indication that something was wrong came when Battlefleet Prime reached the edge of human space. Instead of finding the scattered defensive forces they expected, Kree Thak scouts reported that human ships were waiting for them. Not dozens of ships, Zektar said. Not hundreds. Thousands of human vessels, arranged in defensive formations that covered entire star systems. The intelligence reports had indicated that humanity possessed perhaps 1,000 ships total, most of them the small craft that had engaged Zektar's fleet. But Battlefleet Prime found itself facing human forces that were numerically comparable to their own. Where did they come from? Krethak had demanded of his intelligence officers. The answer came in a transmission from the human fleet commander. Admiral Krethak, the human voice announced, "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Chun, commanding the Terran Defense Force. Your empire was warned to avoid further aggression against human space. Since you have chosen to ignore that warning, you will now experience the consequences." Sarah Chun, Zektar said to the journalist, the same commander who had spoken to me at Sol 7. But now she held a rank that indicated she commanded far more than a single colony's defenses. The human fleet that faced Battlefleet Prime was unlike anything Imperial intelligence had reported. These weren't the small, agile craft that had engaged Zektar's forces. These were massive vessels, each one the size of Imperial dreadnoughts, equipped with weapons that registered energy signatures beyond anything in Imperial arsenals. Admiral Chun transmitted a proposal. Zektar continued. A single combat engagement to determine the outcome of the conflict. One human ship against one Imperial vessel, with the losing side withdrawing from the contested region. Krethak had accepted immediately. The proposal played to Imperial strengths and cultural preferences. Single combat was a concept the Empire understood and respected. More importantly, it allowed them to demonstrate superior technology without risking their entire fleet. The Imperial champion was the dreadnought Eternal Dominion, Zektar said. 40 kilometers of advanced weaponry and armor crewed by our most elite warriors. A ship that had personally destroyed civilizations. The human champion was smaller, perhaps half the size of the Imperial dreadnought. It bore no identifying markings and transmitted no tactical data. According to sensors, it appeared to be constructed from materials that Imperial science couldn't identify. The engagement began at maximum weapons range, Zektar continued. Standard Imperial doctrine for ship-to-ship combat. Eternal Dominion opened fire with its full arsenal, weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts, unleashing their destructive power against the human vessel. The energy output was sufficient to vaporize a small moon, concentrated into beams that moved at near-light speed. The human ship didn't try to evade or defend. Instead, it did something that redefined Imperial understanding of space combat. It ate the attack, Zektar said simply. Every weapon, every energy beam, every particle of destruction. The human ship absorbed it all and somehow incorporated the energy into its own structure. The human vessel began to grow, its hull expanding and reconfiguring itself using the absorbed Imperial firepower. What had been a sleek warship transformed into something larger, more complex, more threatening. Then it fired back. The return attack wasn't a conventional weapon discharge. Instead, the human ship projected some kind of field that caused space around Eternal Dominion to change. The Imperial dreadnought found itself surrounded by an environment where the laws of physics operated differently. Gravity reversed inside the ship, Zektar explained. Electromagnetic fields inverted their polarity. Molecular bonds began dissolving and reforming randomly. The crew of Eternal Dominion experienced effects that their minds couldn't process. Up became down, energy became matter, time moved backward in some sections of the ship while accelerating in others. Within minutes, the massive dreadnought was tearing itself apart at a fundamental level. But Admiral Chen wasn't finished demonstrating human capabilities, Zektar said. As Eternal Dominion destroyed itself, she transmitted an explanation of what was happening. The human weapon wasn't targeting the Imperial ship directly. Instead, it was altering the local reality to demonstrate principles that human science had mastered centuries ago. The destruction of Eternal Dominion was incidental to the educational demonstration. She was teaching us physics, Zektar realized, showing us how humans could manipulate the fundamental forces that govern matter and energy. But the lesson was far from over. As the remains of Eternal Dominion scattered into component atoms, the human ship began another transformation. The absorbed Imperial technology was being analyzed, understood, and improved upon in real time. Within hours, the human vessel had become a perfect replica of Eternal Dominion, Zektar said. But better, enhanced beyond Imperial engineering capabilities using our own technology as a foundation. The implications were staggering. Humans could not only absorb and redirect enemy attacks, they could analyze and improve enemy technology faster than their opponents could deploy it. Any advantage the Empire developed would be temporary at best. Admiral Kree Thak should have withdrawn then, Zektar said. Honor had been satisfied, the challenge completed. But he made the same mistake High Command had made. Pride demanded escalation. Kree Thak declared the single combat inconclusive and ordered Battlefleet Prime to engage the human forces directly. If one Imperial ship wasn't sufficient to demonstrate superiority, 2 million would surely overwhelm any defense. The humans have been hoping for exactly that decision, Zektar said grimly. As Battlefleet Prime moved into attack formation, human vessels throughout the contested region began broadcasting the same message simultaneously. Imperial Fleet, you have chosen escalation over wisdom. You will now experience human warfare without restraint. Without restraint, Zektar repeated. Everything we had experienced before had been humans holding back, using minimal force to achieve their objectives. Now, they were going to show us what they could do when they stopped caring about collateral damage. The first human attack came from directions that Imperial sensors couldn't detect. Ships throughout Battlefleet Prime suddenly found themselves under fire from weapons that seemed to originate from inside their own hulls. But these weren't the surgical strikes that Zektar's fleet had experienced. They were targeting life support systems, Zektar explained. Not trying to disable ships or capture territory. They were killing crews directly. Imperial vessels throughout the fleet began experiencing simultaneous life support failures. Atmosphere poisoned, gravity fluctuated to lethal levels, radiation shielding collapsed. Within minutes, millions of Imperial warriors were dying from environmental hazards that appeared without warning. But the ships themselves remained intact, Zektar continued. Perfectly functional vessels with dead crews. The humans were demonstrating that they could kill us without damaging our technology. As Imperial forces struggled to understand how their life support systems were being targeted, human ships began to appear throughout Battlefleet Prime's formation, not arriving through normal space travel, but simply materializing in optimal attack positions. They weren't using the dimensional phasing we had seen before, Zektar said. This was something far more sophisticated. They were creating temporary spatial corridors that allowed instantaneous movement across interstellar distances. The human attacks were coordinated with precision that suggested perfect communication across impossible distances. Ships that were light years apart attacked in perfect synchronization, their timing calculated to maximize the psychological impact on Imperial forces. And then Zektar said, his voice dropping to a whisper, they started singing again. The harmonic frequencies that had disrupted Imperial equipment during Zektar's encounter returned, but amplified beyond anything they had experienced before. This time, the songs weren't just affecting technology. They were affecting the Imperial warriors directly. The harmony was beautiful, Zektar admitted. Even as it killed us, it was the most perfect sound any of us had ever heard. Imperial crews throughout the fleet began experiencing euphoric hallucinations as the human harmonics interacted with their brain chemistry. Warriors trained to endure any hardship found themselves overwhelmed by sensations of peace and contentment that made resistance impossible. They were using our own neurochemistry against us, Zektar explained. The songs triggered responses that made violence psychologically impossible. Our warriors were dying with smiles on their faces. But Admiral Kree Thak was made of sterner stuff than his crews. As his fleet died around him in beautiful, terrible harmony, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He activated the Empire's ultimate weapon, Zektar said quietly. The reality bomb. The cantina had fallen completely silent now, every patron straining to hear Zektar's final words. Even the serving staff had stopped moving, understanding that they were witnessing the conclusion of a tale that would be spoken of in whispers for generations. The reality bomb, Zektar said, his voice barely audible, was the Empire's most closely guarded secret. A weapon so devastating that its very existence was known to only a handful of beings in the galaxy. He paused, gathering the strength to describe what came next. The journalist waited, understanding that these final memories were the most difficult for the old warrior to relive. It was designed to destroy the fundamental structure of space-time itself, Zektar continued. Not just matter or energy, but the basic framework that allows reality to exist. When activated, it would create an expanding sphere of absolute nothingness that would consume everything in its path. The weapon had been developed during the Empire's early expansion, when they had encountered ancient artifacts that suggested other species had achieved technological levels that threatened Imperial supremacy. The reality bomb was their answer to any threat that conventional weapons couldn't address. Admiral Kree believed that even humans couldn't survive the complete destruction of local reality, Zektar said. He was willing to sacrifice his entire fleet if it meant eliminating humanity as a threat to the Empire. The activation sequence for the reality bomb required authorization from multiple Imperial sources, safeguards designed to prevent its accidental deployment. But, as his fleet died around him in harmonic euphoria, Kree had overridden every safety protocol and initiated the weapon's startup sequence. It takes 17 minutes for the reality bomb to fully activate, Zektar explained. 17 minutes during which space-time begins to destabilize in preparation for complete annihilation. The effects of the weapon's preparation phase were immediately obvious. Space around Battlefleet Prime began to ripple and distort as the fundamental forces that held reality together started to weaken. Stars flickered as their nuclear processes became inconsistent. Planets developed impossible gravitational anomalies. The humans detected what was happening immediately, Zektar said. Admiral Chun contacted Kree directly, her voice carrying something I had never heard from a human before. Fear. Admiral Kree, you have initiated a weapon that will destroy everything within a radius of 50 light years. Your own forces, your colonies, your homeworlds. Everything will cease to exist. But Kree was beyond reason. Pride and desperation had driven him to a decision that would result in the destruction of billions of Imperial citizens, sacrificed to ensure that humanity would die with them. Admiral Chun tried to negotiate, Zektar continued. She offered complete human withdrawal from the contested regions, a permanent peace treaty, even technological assistance to help the Empire expand in other directions. Kree had refused every offer. In his mind, humanity represented an existential threat to Imperial civilization. Better to die destroying that threat than to live knowing that humans could end Imperial expansion whenever they chose. That's when the humans revealed their final capability, Zektar said. Something that even they had hoped never to use. With 7 minutes remaining until reality dissolution, human ships throughout the region began broadcasting a new harmonic frequency. Not the beautiful, deadly songs they had used against Imperial crews, but something far more complex and powerful. They were singing to reality itself, Zektar said in amazement, using harmonic frequencies to communicate with the fundamental forces that govern space and time. The human harmonics began to counteract the reality bomb's effects, somehow convincing the universe to maintain its structural integrity despite the weapon's attempt to destroy it. Space-time stabilized, gravitational anomalies corrected themselves, and stars resumed their normal fusion processes. They weren't stopping the weapon, Zektar realized. They were teaching reality to ignore it. But even this incredible demonstration wasn't the humans' final revelation. As the reality bomb's countdown continued toward zero, Admiral Chun transmitted one last message to the Imperial forces. Admiral Kree, we understand your desperation and fear. Humanity has faced extinction before, and we know what it drives beings to attempt. But there's something you need to understand about human nature before your weapon activates. She paused, Zektar said, and then delivered words that changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. Humans don't fight to win. We fight to survive. And survival means ensuring that the conditions that threatened us never exist again. With 3 minutes remaining until detonation, Admiral Chun explained humanity's true strategic objective. The humans hadn't been trying to defeat the Empire militarily. They had been studying Imperial psychology, culture, and strategic thinking throughout the entire conflict. Every engagement had been designed to gather information about how the Empire responded to different types of pressure. They were learning how to change us, Zektar realized. Not destroy us, not conquer us, but transform us into something that would never threaten them again. The harmonic frequencies that had affected Imperial crews weren't just weapons. They were surgical tools designed to modify Imperial brain chemistry at the genetic level. The euphoric effects that had prevented resistance were permanent alterations that would be passed on to future generations. They were making us incapable of aggressive expansion, Zektar said with a mixture of horror and admiration. Rewriting our fundamental nature to eliminate the psychological drives that led to conquest. But the genetic modifications were only part of humanity's strategy. They had also been subtly influencing imperial technology, introducing design elements that would limit the Empire's military capabilities while appearing to enhance them. Every improvement our engineers made based on captured human technology actually reduced our combat effectiveness, Zektar explained. We thought we were adapting their innovations to serve our purposes, but they had designed their tech to make us less threatening. The social and political intelligence that humans had gathered during their observation of the Empire was being used to manipulate imperial decision-making at the highest levels. Key officials were being influenced through methods so subtle that they remained unaware of the manipulation. Humans have been reshaping our civilization for decades, Zektar said, guiding us towards social structures that valued exploration and trade over conquest and domination. Admiral Chen's final transmission revealed the scope of humanity's long-term planning. Admiral, your reality bomb will activate in 90 seconds. When it does, it will destroy this entire region of space. But humanity has already achieved our objective. Your empire has been modified to be compatible with galactic civilization. The weapon detonated exactly on schedule, Zektar said quietly. 50 light-years of space, including Battlefleet Prime and 17 Imperial colonies, simply ceased to exist. But Admiral Chun had been correct. The empire that remained was fundamentally different from the one that had initiated hostilities against humanity. The genetic modifications, technological limitations, and social influences had transformed imperial civilization at its core. Within months of the battle, imperial expansion stopped completely, Zektar explained. Not from lack of capability, but from lack of desire. Our people simply lost interest in conquest. The empire began redirecting its resources toward exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. Imperial colonies that had been established through force began establishing diplomatic relationships with their neighbors. The military forces that remained were restructured for defensive purposes only. Humans had done to us what we had done to dozens of other species, Zektar said. They had conquered us. But instead of enslaving or destroying us, they had made us better. The transformation wasn't immediate or obvious. Imperial citizens believed they were making their own choices, following their own cultural evolution toward more peaceful pursuits. The human influence was too subtle to be detected by those experiencing it. Most of my people never realized what had happened, Zektar continued. They simply believed that imperial values had naturally evolved toward cooperation instead of domination. But Zektar had been present during the initial contact. He had experienced human capabilities firsthand and understood the scope of their strategic planning. He knew that the Empire's transformation wasn't natural evolution, but careful manipulation by a species that understood warfare better than anyone in the galaxy. Humans don't fight to win wars, he repeated. They fight to make future wars impossible. The journalist finally spoke, his voice filled with awe. What happened to humanity after the conflict ended? Zektar managed something that might have been a smile. They continued exactly as they always had. Exploring, learning, growing. The transformation of my people was just one project among many. Human expansion had accelerated after their conflict with the Empire, but it followed completely different patterns than imperial conquest. They established colonies through negotiation and cooperation, sharing technology and resources with species that welcomed human presence. But they also began preparing for the next threat, Zektar said, because humans understand that survival requires constant vigilance. The human colonies that had been attacked during the imperial expansion were rebuilt and fortified, but not in ways that would be immediately obvious to potential aggressors. Instead, humans had developed defenses that appeared to be civilian infrastructure while actually representing the most sophisticated military preparations in galactic history. Every human world is now a fortress, Zektar explained. But they're fortresses that look like peaceful colonies, disguised so completely that enemies wouldn't recognize the danger until it was far too late. The technology that humans had revealed during their conflict with the Empire represented only a fraction of their actual capabilities. Most human worlds possessed defenses that could repel attacks from forces far larger than Battlefleet Prime. But these defenses remained hidden unless activated by genuine threats. They learned from our conflict too, Zektar said. They realized that displaying their full capabilities would frighten other species into forming alliances against them. Instead, humans had adopted a policy of apparent vulnerability combined with devastating response to actual aggression. They appeared peaceful and defenseless until attacked, then revealed just enough military capability to end the threat while maintaining the illusion that they were simply lucky or resourceful. The galaxy believes that humanity survived our attacks through superior strategy and advanced technology, Zektar said. They don't understand that we were allowed to survive as an educational demonstration. Other species considering aggression against human space now had detailed reports of what had happened to the Empire's forces. But those reports described human capabilities that seemed barely superior to conventional military technology, encouraging potential enemies to believe they could succeed where the Empire had failed. Humans want to be challenged, Zektar realized. Each conflict teaches them something new about galactic military capabilities and allows them to refine their own defensive strategies. The journalist leaned back, overwhelmed by the implications of what he had heard. So humanity is using warfare as a learning tool. Humans use everything as a learning tool, Zektar corrected. War, peace, cooperation, conflict. Every interaction teaches them something new about the species they encounter. He finished his drink and prepared to leave, his story finally complete. But the journalist had one more question. Fleet Commander, why are you telling me this? Why reveal humanity's true nature? Zektar stood slowly, his scarred frame reflecting a lifetime of battles and defeats. Because someone needs to understand what we're really dealing with. The galaxy thinks humans are just another species that got lucky in a conflict with the Empire. He looked around the cantina at the faces of beings from dozens of different worlds, all of them processing the implications of what they had heard. But humans aren't just another species. They're the species that evolution has been working towards since life began. Perfect predators disguised as peaceful explorers. Warriors who fight to end warfare. Conquerors who transform their enemies into allies. The galaxy, Zektar said as he headed toward the door, belongs to humanity now. They're just being polite about it. As the old warrior disappeared into the storm-swept night, the cantina remained silent. Each patron was left to contemplate the same terrifying realization that had driven Zektar to the edge of known space. Humanity had won more than a military conflict against the Empire. They had won the future of galactic civilization itself, transforming potential enemies into willing participants in their vision of universal cooperation. And they had done it so skillfully that their subjects believed they were making their own choices. The journalist turned off his recording device and ordered another drink. He had come seeking a story about military tactics and alien warfare. Instead, he had learned that the greatest battle in galactic history hadn't been fought with weapons at all. It had been fought with understanding, patience, and a kind of strategic thinking that operated on timescales beyond anything other species could comprehend. Humanity didn't just fight wars. They designed futures. And in that future, everyone had a place, as long as they were willing to be guided by the species that had learned to make war obsolete by making it unnecessary. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cantina, the only sound was the quiet contemplation of beings who finally understood why resistance to human expansion had become unthinkable. It wasn't fear that prevented opposition. It was the growing realization that cooperation with humanity offered something that no species had achieved alone. A galaxy where survival didn't require constant warfare, where growth didn't require conquest, and where even former enemies could find prosperity and purpose. Humanity had given them hope. And hope, as every military strategist knew, was the most powerful weapon of all.